People ask a lot about what is it that makes somebody a Buddhist? And in fact, the traditional answer is a Buddhist is somebody who, as it said, takes refuge in the three jewels, the three rare and precious objects, meaning the Buddha himself, the founder of the tradition, the Dharma, his teachings, and the Sangha, the community of those who followed the Buddha's teachings and therefore act as our helpers and companions in the practice of the Dharma taught by the Buddha. But this phrase, take refuge, that's kind of could sound a little odd actually, so I want to explain that. In fact, what we really need to know to begin with is that, in a sense, all beings already possess the qualities of enlightenment, at least in a kind of embryonic fashion. Every sentient being, every being endowed with a mind, has the potential to awaken to the nature of reality, which is the meaning of the name the Buddha, the one who awaken. But be that as it may, obviously, experientially, practically, we don't realize that potential that we possess for wisdom, compassion, and enlightened activity. And so because we're alienated from it, we're somehow lost, continue to lose contact with it. We're in ignorance of our own fundamental nature. And as a result of that, because of our alienation from our true nature, we get entangled continuously in all kinds of sufferings, brought about by our ignorance and by the disturbing emotions, hatred, desire, and so on that arise from that, and by the actions we make prompted by those disturbing emotions. So in short, we're actually revolving generally in a kind of cycle of suffering, of frustration, disappointment, and suffering. For some beings, it's very intense. For others, it's not so obvious. But all of us are, in a sense, alienated from what we can be and from what we really are. So we need some protection from that suffering. We need to connect with a source of protection, of strength. Ultimately, that protection, strength comes from none other than the Buddha nature itself, our fundamental nature, the fundamental nature of reality. But from where we're at the moment, that's not so possible to see or to connect with. So we make a connection with it through the three jewels, because the Buddha is the one who himself awakened to this true nature of reality, an awakening which is possible for all of us. So he represents, as it were, the principle of enlightenment in its most obvious form. And then he shared his understanding, his understanding of what is the cause of suffering and what is the way to overcome it in the Dharma. So the Dharma is also a source of protection. And those people who followed the Dharma, those men and women who through the ages have followed the Dharma, especially those who achieve realization at some level of the Dharma, are again a source of protection because they're our helpers. So we take refuge in the three jewels for protection from suffering. How long do we do that? Well, until actually we've gained that protection. Not just a temporary kind of protection, not just a kind of temporary solution to our problems, but until we've gained final liberation from suffering. That is generally how long we should say that we will take refuge. So now I want to explain a little bit about refuge in 5 ways. First of all, to talk about what are the motivations we need in refuge, then a little bit more about the objects, then about the method, then about the way we train when we've taken refuge, and finally about the benefits. So I'm going to, of course, summarize each of these 5 points very briefly. Essentially, the motive for taking refuge, well, we've touched on it. It begins with this sense of, one might even say, fear. Fear in the sense of recognizing that there is suffering in our life. There's suffering in the life of all beings, in fact, of course. But there's suffering in our life, whether it's experiential suffering right now, in a physical way, or experiential suffering in the sense of emotional distress or loss, or just actual alienation from a sense of what is real. all these are a kind of manifestation of suffering. And so they drive us to look for something real, for something dependable, for some solid basis to plant our feet. And that is provided by the refuges, since they represent, as it were, the connection with reality, with ultimate reality. So fear is part of it, but part of the motivation. But it's got to be allied with confidence. Confidence that the three refuges actually are a valid source of protection, not just a fantasy, not just an antique, not just some wishful thinking, but they actually provide means for protection. And that means, therefore, that a degree of intelligence has got to come into our thinking. The three refuges are not some savior, not some creator God, but they are the principles, as it were, the principles of reality. And the final and highest motivation is when we link our suffering and our situation to the suffering of others and think, actually, although I cannot provide protection for everybody right now from suffering, because I'm still ignorant, because I'm still trapped in my disturbing emotions, nevertheless that's what I want to do. So we bring compassion for others into the mix of motivation. So fear, faith and compassion, they're the motivation. Then the objects. Well, we've already begun by discussing them. The three objects in which we take refuge are the Buddha, the Supreme Teacher for all of us Buddhists. Of course, we may have human teachers, we will have human teachers, but the Buddha is, if you like, the primary teacher for anybody who's a Buddhist, because we see that he has seen the true nature of reality, and therefore he is a dependable source of guidance, the best of all teachers, we might say. And that human being, the Buddha, the Indian prince who woke to the nature of reality 500 years ago, he's in a sense just a representative of enlightenment, of Buddhahood. It's because what he awoke to, everybody can awaken to. As he himself said, other people have awoken to this, have realized this. I'm merely revealing an old but temporarily forgotten path. So in a sense, Buddhahood is a universal principle. It's not one that's bound in time and space to that one individual. But he is like the most personal manifestation of it that we can see right now in our particular cultural period. So the Buddha is the first object of refuge. The Dharma, the teaching he gave. Now, what is the teaching? Of course, in one way, the teaching is a record of his advice, found in the scriptures that preserve his oral teachings. But in a second sense, the Dharma is our experience of the path that we embark upon by following and putting to practice the Buddha's teachings. So there's an experiential aspect to the Dharma. It's not enough simply to assent to the teachings in the scriptures. We must experience their reality for ourselves. So the Dharma is twofold. As the Buddha is twofold, the individual human being, the Buddha, and the enlightened principle of enlightenment, so the Dharma is twofold. The scriptural teachings and the experiential realization of them. And the third object, the Sangha. The Sangha, the community of those who practice. In a way, the Sangha is simply everybody who's gone before us on the path. All the women and men who've gone forward before us. Visibly, they're most obviously represented by the renunciates, by the monks and nuns. But from a deeper point of view, is everybody who has taken refuge and entered into the path. And beyond those ordinary people who embody the principle of the Sangha, there's the noble ones, the ones who've gained actually realization, whose advice and help to us will be very reliable and very trustworthy. So those are the three objects of refuge. Later on in more extensive presentations on the Dharma, we can amplify them, but for now, the three jewels. And then the method of taking refuge. Well, as a beginner, most beginners will take refuge simply with the feeling of wishing for protection from suffering, their own individual suffering. And most people will think of it as from now to the end of this life. And in that way, they will go for refuge to the Buddha as their teacher, the Dharma as the path, and the Sangha as the friends, the companions who will help them with the practice of the Dharma. Gradually, as they understand more about the nature of the three jewels and nature of refuge, this understanding will deepen. But as a beginner, that's what we're doing. Taking refuge in the Buddha as teacher, the Dharma as path, and the Sangha as the companions. And then, having entered into refuge, having taken refuge, and therefore become a Buddhist, because that is the mark of being a Buddhist. A Buddhist is someone who has taken refuge in the three jewels, and all Buddhist practice begins with that act of taking refuge. Whatever meditation one does, whatever study one does on a daily basis or more intermittently, one always begins it with refuge to signify that it is a Buddhist practice, it's part of the Buddhist path. So the training in general, one could say, is having taken refuge, then to listen to the teachings given by the Buddha, to hear, and then to think, to reflect on those teachings, and then to experience their truth through meditation. So train by hearing, thinking, and meditating. If one put it in a slightly more kind of formal way, one would say that one trains in taking refuge by remembering that the Buddha is our guide, and that although gods, if they exist, or other teachers of other systems may have something valuable about them, for us the Buddha is our teacher. That's the decision we've made. And so we train in the connection with the Buddha by remembering that. And we train in connection with the Dharma by remembering the Dharma is like a medicine to heal the sufferings of beings. So any violence that we may do is contradictory to that. So non-violence is the principal way of training in the Dharma jewel. And the Sangha, well, the Sangha are our companions who will help us with practice the Dharma. That's how we remember the Sangha. They're the companions. We should strive to develop love and compassion for all beings. But all beings cannot guide us in the practice of the Dharma right now because they don't all practice it. So for us, our brothers and sisters in the Dharma are the primary means of training in with the Sangha jewel. And finally, the benefits. The benefits of taking refuge are, in a way, all stem from the fact that we've consciously made a connection with the principle of ultimate reality, of awakening to that ultimate reality. So we're grounded. We have a ground, solid ground underneath our feet, so to speak, for the first time. And that brings about a sense of protection, a sense of stability, of gravity. Of course, difficulties will arise in our life. It's not a magic cure to take a refuge. It's simply a beginning, the first step on the way. But we nevertheless, from that time onwards, if we make the refuges central to our life, we will feel that sense of stability, of protection. And no matter what storms arise in our life, from our internal problems or external faults, we're never destroyed by them. We're never overcome by them. We have a kind of resolute cheerfulness which allows us to persist with our journey to freedom, to liberation from suffering. So that is the benefit of taking refuge. Beyond that, the benefit of taking refuge is that, as I've just said, we made a start on the path. Traditionally it's said, whoever has taken refuge, then by that becomes a basis to receive for making the vows, making the commitments to practice the Dharma that leads finally to the enlightenment itself. So it's like we're connected, we're plugged in once we've taken refuge, and everything will follow from that. So that is taking refuge in the three jewels.